somehow well enough defined and bounded so that one can in fact assess it as a theory. It's not vague. It has the advantage of being very explicit about its claims. And what I would like to do is to assess it quite critically sometimes from various points of view, because I think this gives us a way of seeing how a whole theory can holistically be assessed, which is my particular interest in this. I'm interested in what people think is a theory, what counts as a theory, and how one actually can assess a theory. So the kind of subtext of this lecture is something quite outside Skopos theory. The subtext is, this is my proposal about how a theory could be assessed. And the theory could be any kind of a theory. This is just an example, the Skopos theory. And so this is what I will do. Start off a little bit about the use of the word theory in translation studies in general. And then we will look at the axioms upon which Skopos theory is based. I'm assuming that it will be familiar to most of you, I imagine. You've all read something about Skopos theory. Have you, Anthony, had your seminar on?
We have indeed, yes.
So it's kind of familiar. It's in the background. I imagine you all know roughly what I'm talking about, which is nice.
They're all experts.
Great. So, and you can even disagree, of course. It would be nice if you did. And then I'd like to say something about the conceptual contribution, because this has been debated recently, which is, I think, interesting. And then we will look at some other criteria, its ontological status and its empirical status, and then raise quite a big and difficult subject, which is the ethical aspect. Does it or should it? Does a theory or should a theory or can a theory, which purports to be scientific, can it have an ethical dimension? And here there are a number of differences of opinion, which I will show to you and share you with. And then we will look at the competition, and I will in particular compare Skopos theory to relevance theory, which I think is its nearest competitor. And then I'll draw some conclusions finally. That's roughly where we're going to go. Okay? So we could start by considering how the word theory is used in translation studies, which is in fact rather curious. I think. And I wonder how you would like to add to this. Skopos theory is one of the fairly few approaches in translation studies that actually calls itself a theory. Polysystem theory also calls itself a theory. Well, we have Professor Eozoha sitting with us. He should know. We talk about functional theories. Yes, we do, I'm sure. Perhaps not about the or a functional theory in the singular. Functional theories seems to be a kind of bundle of things, including Skopos theory and a number of other things, which we call functional. Then I thought, well, do we have an equivalence theory? Well, no, we don't. We don't have a body of knowledge which is known as the equivalence theory, it seems to me. We have a number of approaches to equivalence, including Anthony Pym's recent one. We have different analyses of it, different classifications of it. You could say we have a linguistic approach to translation, which uses equivalent as a basic concept in one way or another. But do you think we have an equivalence theory of the same kind of status as Skopos theory? I'm not sure. We perhaps have several. Perhaps that would be plural, like functional theories. I suppose you could say that Nida had an equivalence theory, and Koller had another equivalence theory, and I have another one, and Anthony has a third or a fourth, and so on. And then in French we have, of course, the Théorie du sens at the Paris School of Interpreting. The idea of interpreters deverbalizing and going straight to the message. That they use the word theory to describe what they do, the theory of meaning, or the theory of sense. And then, of course, we have theories which we apply from other fields. We have relevance theory, which calls itself a theory. It's a theory of pragmatics, and we apply it in translation. Some of us do. We have post-colonial theories, which we apply, yes, and they call themselves theories. But they are not theories which have been developed by translation scholars. What would you like to add to the list? Do you think there are other things that call themselves theories in translation studies that you would like to add to this list? Because this is actually quite a short list in that case. Other people, we have approaches, we have frameworks, we have hypotheses, and other kinds of things. Yes, no shortage of those. Well, there's a famous quotation by Peter Newmark.
Explicitation, says James Hadley.
Explicitation is a theory.
He says, or theory of universals.
Universal theory, yes, okay, possible. We could add that, the theory of universals.
We've got translation theory.
Well, we have translation theory, exactly. I was just going to say, but there, when we say translation theory, we seem to mean something rather different by it. We mean not a given theoretical body, a structure. We seem to mean everything that we say theoretically and conceptually about translation.
It's translation studies.
Well, Well, one can argue about that, certainly. Everything theoretical one says about translation studies. Theories about translation. Newmark said about translation theory that there was no such thing as translation theory except simply the body of knowledge we had about translation. He is very anti-theory, which is, I think, interesting. But the point, actually, of this little introductory bit was to draw your attention to the fact that Skopos theory is, in fact, a member of a rather small set. Maybe there are a few more we could add to this list, but we don't get 10, we don't get 20 theories of translation in the same sense as these. I think it's a fairly small and interesting set. It's a special member of this set for the reason that it has a particular structure, as we shall see. But before we get to that structure, I want to draw your attention to the way in which Skopos theory itself defines theory, because there is an interesting conflict between the definition of theory used by Skopos theory and what Skopos theory itself does. I think at least that there is a clash between the two. So here is a quotation in German from Reis and Vermeer. So here this says that by theory one understands the interpretation and linking together of observational data. Okay, so there's observational data, and you make connections between the data, you make a network, this Verknüpfung, and then you interpret it. I mean, that's, I think, fine. That's a fairly standard sort of a definition of an empirical theory. There are observational data, you make connections, and you interpret the connections in some kind of explanatory way. It's a reasonable definition of theory, as opposed to other possible ways in which one could use the term, such as simply approach, as when one talks, shall we say, about post-colonial theory, which is perhaps not so much a theory, but a whole way of approaching something, rather looser, like a whole conceptual framework, or indeed a hypothesis, which is a rather more specific use of the word theory, like explicitation. If you talk about explicitation theory, as Anthony did just now, you mean, I imagine, a particular hypothesis about the tendency towards explicitation in translation studies. It's not an overall theory, it's a particular hypothesis that might form part of an overall theory. So, given this definition of theory that you find in the classic text of Skopos theory, you would expect to find that Skopos theory is indeed based on observational data. And it gradually generalizes and makes connections from this data and then comes to an interpretation. But that's actually not how it works. There is quite a gap between this definition and what they do. Skopos theory is unusual among, I think, all translation theories, all theories which have been so far used in translation, in that it is overtly an axiomatic theory. That is to say, it's a theory which, at its fundamental basis, states explicitly a rather small number of axioms upon which the theory is based and from which everything else follows. So it's a kind of top-down theory, if you like. It starts with abstract or very general assumptions, which indeed you hope are true. An axiom is usually defined as something like something which is obviously true if by common sense or intuition or reason or something that normally one would not doubt axioms. You have to start somewhere, of course, if you build an axiomatic theory. Somebody coming from outside such a theory could certainly begin to question axioms. And if you can show that the axioms upon which an axiomatic theory claims to be based, if you can show that the axioms are not strong, or perhaps even false, then the theory looks very dodgy, because its whole foundation begins to shake. I will try to criticize some of the axioms of this theory. So it belongs to the class of theories that you would call axiomatic. It has a certain syntactic structure, you might say. And so the first thing that we have to do is to look at the axioms of this theory. I'll give you them first as they are listed in the classic work. I don't assume everybody reads German, so I'll translate them a bit as we go. But I imagine these are familiar to you from your background reading in translation studies and perhaps also the seminar that you had with Anthony earlier. Okay, so the first one is a translation is conditioned by its Skopos, determined by its Skopos. The second one is a translation is an offer of information. I'll comment on all these in a minute, okay? The third one is that a translation constructs an offer of information in a way which is not uniquely reversible. So you translate from A to B, but if you go back again from B to A, you don't necessarily get back to where you started. It's the usual, back translation doesn't always take you back to where you started. Okay? That's the claim there, the axiom. Number 4, a translation must be coherent in itself, within itself. It must make sense as a text. Number 5, a translation must be coherent with the source text. And number 6, these rules apply in the order in which they are given here. They are hierarchically ordered, so that the most important ones are at the top and the least important ones come down the bottom. It's a very different kind of axiom from the others. Among other things, that would mean that axiom number 4, a translation must be coherent in itself, is more important than axiom number 5, because of the order in which they are stated. One can make a number of preliminary comments about these axioms. The first one is, I think, interesting in that it does not assume that the Skopos of the translation is the same as the Skopos of the source text. So immediately we are on very different ground from equivalence approaches. It simply says that a translation has its own Skopos. It's conditioned by its own Skopos, or a Skopos. We'll come back to what that means in a minute. The second axiom is a little unusual, but the point of it is that translation is embedded here in a theory of cultural transfer. The idea is that cultural transfer, as it were, proceeds by transferring information of one sort or another between cultures, as we shall hear more about in later lectures by Professor Equivalence. And this information is assumed to be somehow relevant and interesting to the receiver. The translation then simply makes an offer of information. That's a much weaker claim than saying that the translation is equivalent. Notice it doesn't actually, the axiom doesn't state that the translation is equivalent in any way. It simply says it makes an offer of information in some way. What it does say in axiom 5 is that the translation is coherent with the source text. That's a much weaker claim than saying that it's equivalent. In other words, it does not contradict the source text. It somehow makes sense in connection with the source text. It's quite interesting, I think. And the last one is indeed very different. And one might wonder whether the last axiom is indeed as general as is assumed by the writers, because that might be not the case in every single translation that one would imagine. That, for example, the intra-textual coherence is always more important than the inter-textual coherence, that 4 is always more important than 5. When we go through some of the critical points in a minute, it's worth bearing in mind that this theory that we are now discussing sets out to be a general theory of translation. It does not set out to be a theory of certain kind of special case. It's supposed to cover everything. It's supposed to be so general that all the types of translation can be fitted in as subtypes or consequences or subclasses or something of this major, very general theory. Some of these I think we will return to, and we will return to some of them actually quite critically, for perhaps obvious reasons. One wonders, for example, okay, I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Okay. Now, this was the first publication of, or at least this is the classic presentation of these basic 6 axioms. In a later work, which Vermeer wrote in English, he placed these axioms in a more general structure, where he fits Skopos theory into a more broad theory of action theory. Action theory is simply a particular theory of human action, human behavior. And he again proposes a number of axioms. He now calls these things theses in English, but they are, in a way, basic axioms, I think, still. And what he seems to have done here is to have gone up above the set we just looked at, and he now sees how they can be embedded in this more general theory. So the last axiom here is more or less the same as the first axiom we just had. So this set fits on top of the previous set. Okay? So I think that's interesting, because it shows that there is a clear, explicit attempt to relate a particular theory of translation to a more general theory of human action. and to show how they are logically linked. One sits inside the other. So it seems to me to be a good point about a theory, that it explicitly tries to relate itself to things which are a little bit outside it, or more general. It makes a connection. So it's simply one kind of action theory. All action is goal-orientated, actors are rational, actors make optimal choices. Now, one can ponder these quite interestingly, I think. I wonder what you think about these. If you say all action is goal-orientated, you simply say that any behavior which does not appear to be goal-oriented, we will just not call it an action, we will call it an activity. In fact, there is a distinction made in action theory there. So the fact that it's goal-oriented is built into the vocabulary of the system. Actors are rational. Well, that's interesting. That gives us all a bit of pause for thought. Are you rational? You would say, I suppose, well, yes, to some extent, or yes on Tuesdays, but perhaps less so on Mondays, or not at all on Friday evenings, or something. It seems to me that one could also say that actors are irrational, to some extent. If you say actors are rational, it appears, you appear to assume that they are 100% rational, or always rational, or something. Are translators always rational? One wonders. Maybe they seek to be rational. I'm sure Anthony is most of the time rational. But we are probably not rational all the time, I imagine. And there are interesting assumptions here about how the translator's mind is assumed to work. Do you think that you make all your decisions as a translator rationally, or do you think some of them are emotional or intuitive or chance? And then you try to rationalize them afterwards, you try to make sense of them, but to what extent is everything rational? Okay, these are criticisms that have been brought by many scholars to this assumption, this higher axiom that we are dealing with rational logical behavior here, and only with something which is rational. And the next choice is also something where I think there is space for criticism. Actors make optimal choices. In other words, actors try to act in the best way they can. You are a translator, you do your best. You strive to do your best. This is part of what it is to be a translator. And when we have a theory of translation, we are, this is what we shall come to in a minute, we are describing optimal conditions, optimal translation behavior. Then one might wonder, first of all, do we always have optimal conditions to translate? Answer, no. Do translators always try their best? Do they? Don't you think translators sometimes skip corners? They satisfice. They do perhaps something which is not, they know it's not the best one, but they haven't got time to check out the best one. There are many circumstances, it seems to me, where translators might work suboptimally, if by optimal you mean produces the best quality target text. Maybe optimal means to be operationalized a bit there. Maybe they make choices which are always optimal to themselves, but do they? I think this raises many questions, I think. To state this, to assume that this is an axiom which can be universally accepted from common sense without being queried is a little risky. I think there are many ways in which one might want to add reservations to this claim. Okay. Conceptual contribution. Quite apart from any other value that a theory might have, which we'll come to in a few minutes, a theory may bring new concepts. It may refine the concepts that we already use. It may introduce new distinctions that we haven't realized. It may enrich our conceptual vocabulary in a way that is quite distinct from any new hypotheses or other contribution that it might make. Some of these conceptual contributions have been seriously criticized by a number of scholars, and on your handout there I refer you especially to Koller and Kelletat and Hedenstreit, all of whom have been very critical of some aspects of these concepts. One of the biggest criticisms has been that Skopos has never been properly defined. I think there is some truth in that. I think Vermeer would reply to it. When we first meet the word, or when we first have a discussion of the word in Reis and Vermeer, it is said to be quite simply a synonym of Zweck, the German word Zweck, which means a purpose. So Skopos is said to be a synonym for Zweck. Skopos, that's a Greek word, okay? So we introduce a Greek word in order to introduce a new term for a German word which we have already. But it's said to be a synonym of Zweck or Funktion, function. So do we assume that purpose is the same as function? Well, what do you mean then by function? And if you look actually at the way function or Funktion is used in the German text to which I'm referring, the Reis and Vermeer book, you will find that actually the word is used in 2 or 3 quite distinct ways. And it's not really quite adequate to say that Skopos is the same as function if function itself has different senses. And I think Vermeer must have realized this, because in a later he makes a distinction, in a later work, he makes a distinction between Skopos and function and intention, which is followed then by Christiane Nord. And I think this is her formulation that I have here, which I use just to try to illustrate the differences there. This would be one way of making the distinction, but not all the works in Skopos theory seem to keep to this distinction. So it seems that there is a kind of slipperiness among the scholars who work with these terms. Quite what do they mean by them? Let's first look at the terms and then see to what extent are they justified. So one claim is that Skopos means what the translation is for. Function is the text purpose as inferred by the recipient. That's Christiane Nord's formulation. So if I read a translation, as I read the translation, I'm the recipient, I infer that the text has a certain purpose. Anthony sends me an email which is translated from Greek, and I assume that the translation has a certain purpose, a certain function, which is inferred by me as I read the text. And then the intention is what the client wants to do. Intentions are things that people can have, not texts can have. This is the idea there, okay? So a text can have a Skopos and a function, and a client can have an intention. But then one does wonder whether we need 3 different terms. One of the problems which is quite widespread in translation theory or translation studies, I think, is that we have more terms than we have concepts. And other people might argue the opposite, that we have more concepts than we have terms. But there is not a good match, I think, between the terms and the concepts. And I think I would argue myself that this distinction between Skopos and function and intention is not terribly helpful. I'm not sure whether we need 3 quite separate terms. If we already have function, why do we also need Skopos, I wonder? Do we only need it because it's a Greek term that sounds impressive? do both Skopos and function simply mean intended effect? If you define Skopos as intended effect, we have the client's intention. The client intends that the translation will have a certain effect on the reader. And that, to me, makes some kind of a sense. However, it raises problems, because it seems to assume, first, that a translation will only have one primary effect, intended effect, and it assumes also that all the clients are homogeneous and they will all be receiving the same effect. Now, suppose a text has different effects on different people at different times. Do we want to say that the Skopos changes, or do we want to say that the intention changes, or that the function changes, or that there are multiple functions? It seems to me that it's actually quite complicated, and a lot more complicated than Skopos theory assumes. Another criticism that has been made of Skopos theory is that not all texts do in fact have Skopoi. One of the early points made by Kohlmeier, for example, who is a fierce opponent of Skopos theory in all its forms, was that literary texts don't have a Skopos. Whereupon Vermeer replies and says, certainly literary texts have a Skopos. It may just be rather vague and unclear, but there can be no text without a Skopos. Do you think there can be a text or a translation without a Skopos? Do you think it would be possible to find a translation which did not have a Skopos? If it didn't have a Skopos, it would falsify the claim that all translations have Skopoi, to use the Greek plural. That would be quite hard. It seems to be so obvious that is it really worth saying that it must have some purpose, some effect or something. So there have been many arguments about the definitions of these terms, and for many scholars they remain unsatisfactory, they remain vague. Other conceptual points
Can
are...
I interrupt?
Sure.
The whole of Kantian aesthetics is based on the notion of purposelessness, Zwecklosigkeit. The aesthetic text is a text without purpose by definition for Kant.
Well, that's probably what Kohlmeier would appeal to, but Vermeer would reject that argument.
Well, that's taking on the big giant of rational argument.
Vermeer would have argued, and indeed did argue, that maybe the purpose of any aesthetic text is to be beautiful. Why is that not an acceptable Skopos?
Fine, fair enough.
I mean, I think he has a point.
If he'd argued that, yes.
I think he has argued that, I think, or something like that. I think Kohlmeier's argument against Vermeer is weak here. I think you can always, I mean, okay, there is Shakespeare and he's writing Hamlet, all right. Does he have a Skopos? Probably, you know, I must make some money, or I must employ these wretched actors, or here is Keats writing a sonnet, or whatever. I mean, the purpose might be to express myself. Isn't that's a purpose? That's a Skopos. I mean, it seems to me impossible to argue that there is no Skopos. So I'm with Vermeer on this one, and I'm not with Kohlmeier. Would you want to differ?
Oh, I think Kant has his word to say that what is aesthetic in these actions or in these texts is that which is not purposeful in the sense of human interaction.
You mean the artist was not trying to be beautiful, but actually...
No, to be beautiful would be Kant's, he would accept that, I think, as Zwecklosigkeit. There is no purpose beyond itself.
Well, to be beautiful is a purpose.
If you like, that's fine, I have no trouble with that.
Well, that's all right then. Okay.
Continue beautifully, Andy.
Okay, all right. Okay. I wonder what you think about some of these other central concepts. For example, the use of the term coherence. Now, if one was a terminologist, one could argue, and it has been argued, that it's not good practice to use the same term within the same theory with two separate meanings. Coherence in terms, it makes sense within itself. I can understand what this translation is about, okay? That's axiom 4, right? It has to be coherent an sich, or whatever it was, okay? And then, do you really mean, are you using the word coherence in the same sense when you say that a translation is coherent with its source text, rather than say it's faithful to, or similar to, or equivalent to its source text? Aren't you using the word coherence in two different ways? And I think, yes, I think you are, really. I think that's a bit slippery. And one wonders why they chose it. Why don't they just use equivalent? Because they do accept that there are different sorts of equivalence between texts. That the word comes in the theory. It's not banned by Skopos theory. They use equivalence. But for some reason or other, it doesn't appear as a term which is as important as coherence in one of the axioms. And so a critic might say it's a bit risky to use the same term with two slightly different meanings. In fact, it was the adjective coherent, not coherence. But I cheated there a bit. Okay, the offer of information. Vermeer says at one point that any text is an offer of information. So that a translation is actually an offer of information about an offer of information. Okay? And then one wonders really, why is this worth saying? Because it seems to be such a weak claim. One wonders what's meant by information. This has also been critical, that this doesn't actually bring anything to the theory, claim the critics, which the theory really needs. It's too loose. On the other hand, there has been a lot of approval, I think, and acceptance of the fact that German scholarship, German translation studies in general, uses a term to cover both translation and interpreting, which we have not managed to do in English. So in German, this is not invented by Skopos theory, but it is continued by Skopos theory. The idea of saying die Translation, not die Übersetzung, okay, and then Dolmetschung, okay, but you have an upper term covering both translation and interpreting. That's, I think, helpful. We haven't yet managed to do this in English, unless you have translation with a capital T that some people use, including, if you have translation with capital T, it includes translation with small t and interpreting. Well, that's not so neat as the German, but you have Translation, Übersetzung, Dolmetsch. Okay, that's neat, that's helpful. Then there are problems with adequacy, because in Skopos theory, the term adequacy is used in a very different way to the way it's used in many other theories. For example, Skopos theory's meaning of adequacy is quite different from Gideon Turi's use of the word adequacy, which came first, as far as I know. Because for Turi, and for many people, adequacy means something like closeness to the source, as opposed to acceptability. You remember the basic Turi division between adequacy and acceptability? Okay? But in Skopos theory, adequacy has a very different meaning, because it means how close is it to the Skopos. So you measure adequacy not in terms of relation to the source, but relation to the Skopos. That's completely different. And I think it was a risky decision by the Skopos theory people to take a term which already exists in translation studies and give it a completely new meaning. Because it means that when any translation scholar nowadays uses the word adequacy, you have to specify which sense you're using it in. Otherwise the reader is confused. Or you simply decide that you do not use the word adequacy because it's so ambiguous. I think I decided that myself some years ago. I simply stopped using it. I found it so irritating to have to specify every single time which sense I meant. So the term has become useless because it's become ambiguous. And I think that was perhaps a mistake, a terminological mistake. Again, on the positive side, I think this last point has been a good one. The point made by, in the discussion of Skopos theory, distinguishing different kinds of agents involved, because quite often in the older theories, the older approaches to translation, you have the translator, and then you have the reader, and you have the client or something. Or you have the source text author, and the translator and the reader. But when Skopos theory begins to distinguish between different sorts of agents involved in this whole process, they make distinctions between the addressee and the recipient. They bring in the publisher versus the client. You have a much richer set of who is involved in the whole event, rather than a rather simple sender and receiver, for example, that NIDA operated with. You remember you had the sender and the recipient, in fact, the S and the R. That's pretty simple. And I think it's nice that Skopos theory introduced a much more sophisticated, or a somewhat more sophisticated analysis of the different agents involved, which certainly gives it a more sociological orientation. Okay, now we move on to another topic. This is something that's been taken up by a Spanish scholar recently, which I think is actually quite interesting. I haven't quite decided how serious this point is, this criticism, but I thought it was interesting enough to raise with you. The idea here is that many theories, including this one, are based on cognitive metaphors of some sort or another. The way we see a particular field is often anchored in some kind of metaphorical picture that we have. And a cognitive linguist would talk about cognitive metaphors here. Okay? And Martín de León argues, quite interestingly, that inside Skopos theory, there are in fact two basic cognitive metaphors, two underlying metaphors, which conflict. And this is her criticism, that they are not coherent with each other. And for her, this is an argument for the view that the theory itself is inconsistent, because it tries to combine two different approaches which don't match. Okay, now I wonder whether you will agree or not agree with this. We will have some pause at the end, sometime at the end, I hope, for discussion. So, to give her argument, she argues that the two metaphors involved are, first of all, the transfer metaphor, and secondly, the target metaphor. Now, the transfer metaphor is the cognitive idea that the cognitive metaphor that translation involves moving something from A to B along a passage, a conduit, okay, along a path. So, in its most simple sense, you could say, here is this message, and I will carry this message from A to B. Or I will carry this meaning from A to B across a language bridge or difference or something, okay? The idea is that you are carrying something from something to somewhere else, and it is a something that doesn't change. It's a variant on Nida's well-known metaphor of the suitcase, okay? You take your suitcase full of clothes, you go through the customs, and the customs man says, let me see your suitcase, and you unpack your suitcase and show everything you have, and then you repack it in a new way and you take it to the other country. Now they're the same clothes. For Nida this is very important. They are the same clothes in the same suitcase. They're simply repackaged. Okay? So this metaphor would assume that there is something that remains constant, which is carried across the river, or through the customs, or over the bridge, or something. Okay, something which is transferred, this X. And some people have argued, for example, Martín de León, that this this idea, which is embedded inside the way in which Skopos theory sees translation as a kind of cultural transfer. There you have the transfer idea. Is simply one form of cultural transfer. This, say the critics, this overlooks the idea, the claim, that meanings are not objective billiard balls that you carry along from one place to another, but they are subject to interpretation and negotiation, and they emerge from the way in which people read texts, and so on and so on and so on. That they are not objectively there, and that there isn't a message or a thing, an X, which remains unchanged in the text, in the communication as you carry it across the customs. I think this can be argued. I think it would be, for me, it seems that some meanings, some messages change less than others. Some meanings seem to be more objective than others. If there is a meaning, if there is a message, come to the Sala de Graus, whatever the name of this room is at, whatever it is, 6 o'clock, then you don't go to the bank at 6 o'clock, because Sala de Graus has a certain meaning and you come to this room. And it has a certain objectivizable meaning, and you come here rather than go to the bank. But if I say, you know, do you believe that democracy is a good thing, we could all disagree about quite what we meant by democracy. It's a different sort of meaning. It has a different sense. So I think it's difficult to generalize about that. But that's one side, that's one metaphor. The other metaphor, she says, which is embedded in this theory, is the target metaphor, which is the idea that you move along a path to a goal. Now, the assumption here is not necessarily that you are carrying something that remains unchanged, but that you are performing an action which has a goal, and you simply do what you can to reach the goal, to accomplish the purpose. And she sees a series of problems between these two metaphors. What happens, for example, if there are different goals? Do we have to assume that there's only one goal? How do we assess the goals? Suppose the receivers are heterogeneous, and suppose the goal might vary with different sets of receivers. She raises a number of problems here, and also the point about meaning that I mentioned before. So I think this is an interesting way of presenting a criticism of a theory, and I'm not quite sure to what extent I think this is a really fundamentally important one. I haven't decided that for myself yet. I find it very interesting that one can analyze a theory in terms of the cognitive metaphors upon which it's based. Does it make the theory less good if the metaphors seem to clash with each other, not to be quite consistent? One could argue that that's not a very good argument, because these metaphors are only interpretations. They are not facts, they are not truths, they are not empirical. They are simply interpretive hypotheses, in a way. They are interpretations of how a theory conceptualizes its main ideas. So for me, there's a kind of question mark after that particular criticism that has been made. I feel much more comfortable with many of the other, or some of the other criticisms anyway. This next point is something which I feel much more secure about, in that I think that this is a much more serious criticism. And I'm sure it's been made, or I know it's been made, by a great many people. And I think the theory is ambiguous upon this point. I call this the problem of ontological status. By that I mean, I think it is a problem what is this theory claiming to be a theory of? What kind of reality is it attempting to describe? Is it intending to be a descriptive theory, describing the way things are, or is it intending to be a prescriptive theory, describing some ideal world? And I find great ambiguity in the writings here. I have my own opinion. I think it's clearly prescriptive, for reasons which I will come to later. It seems to me that